number 723. See if I can figure out how to not get so much breath in the mic. Good to be here this evening. Appreciate your presence on a Wednesday evening, and I appreciate the opportunity to continue our studies on the hard sayings of Christ. Brother Jason, thank you for reading that passage for us. Because of that, we're not going to reread that passage, but we will refer back to some things that Jesus said there. What he's teaching us is a few different things. And he starts out by saying, it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He knew that his audience would know that phrase, be familiar with that concept, and a lot of them would be okay with that. The idea of paying back someone if they have wronged us. But Jesus is trying to teach us, them and us today, that we've got to change our thinking. When something negative or bad happens to us, someone treats us badly, we need to respond differently than what we would normally want to respond, and how we would normally respond. And the first thing I want to look at is, what are we being asked to do? So we're going to talk about this passage, and there's primarily three different things that I identified that Jesus mentions, that things that we should do, ways that we should be different. We're also going to talk about, why is this a hard saying? And then finally, we're going to look at some things that I have thought of as I was putting this together on ways we can practice at changing our thinking and becoming more like the way Christ would think. So the first question we have tonight is, what are we being asked to do? What is Jesus asking us here? Well, the first thing he's asking us to do is to resist retaliation. He says, you've heard eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but he says, I say, don't resist the evildoer. Now, his audience would have been familiar with this already. And as I was going through this, trying to put this together, I realized, nothing Jesus mentions here would actually be new to the Jews. They have been familiar with and have been taught these things already. In fact, the Jews had a very well-known king in their history named Solomon, a very wise king who sat down and wrote a whole collection of proverbs. And in some of those proverbs, he brings out this teaching that they would have been familiar with. Teachings like resist retaliation against others. So this is not something that would have been a new idea to them. And yet, it's something that Jesus knew they would need to be reminded of, and so do we. Let's look at a couple of those proverbs. Proverbs 20 and verse 22 says, "Do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you." So Solomon says right there, we don't need to have the mind that we're going to repay somebody if they do us wrong. Instead, we need to allow God to handle that. We also see in Proverbs 24, verse 29, he says, "Do not say, I will do to him as he has done to me. I will pay the man back for what he has done." That couldn't be much clearer, could it? Solomon is saying we must not have the attitude that we're going to get back at somebody for being rude to us, mean to us, evil to us, whatever the case may be. Most of you know that I am the oldest of 9 children, had a lot of siblings growing up, and one night when I was a teenager, my parents went out somewhere. I don't remember if it was a date or going to dinner or what, but they had said, "Don't call us unless you have an emergency." Now, why do I have a delicious-looking ice-cold Dr. Pepper up here? Because we ran out of Dr. Pepper that night. And listen, I'm from South Texas. That's a big deal, okay? You got to have Dr. Pepper. Well, Jennifer, my oldest sibling, the one right after me, she said, "I got to call Mom and Dad. We're out of Dr. Pepper." And of course, I, being the one that was left in charge and had an opportunity to throw my weight around, I said, "Oh, no, you're not going to call them. That's not an emergency." She said, "Oh, yes, I am. I'm calling them." So she picked up the phone, and to help some of you guys here, when I say pick up the phone, I mean that she physically picked up a physical device that was kind of curved, and it had a speaker on one end that you put against your ear, and it had a microphone on the other end that goes somewhere around your mouth, and you hold it up to the side of your face. And then she began to dial. And that's actual buttons, by the way. Doot, 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 doot. In the middle of her call, I went, click, and I hung up the phone. And now that's not a red circle that you touch. That's an actual physical button. And when you hang up the phone, the way it worked was the weight of the receiver would push down that button and end the call. But you could also push it with your finger if you wanted to, and I wanted to. So I did. Jennifer, in a rage, tackled me. She just jumped right on top of me. And I vaguely remember kind of fighting her off, going, "Get off me, crazy lady," you know. And I think that was literally, I promise you, maybe the one and only physical altercation I ever had with Jennifer. She's one of the sweetest people ever, okay? But we've always remembered that now, and we laugh about how I called her crazy lady that night. But here's the thing about this story. Neither of us were acting the way we should. I was trying to throw my weight around and be bossy, so I was treating her badly. In response, she retaliated. And I had also retaliated too by retaliating that she didn't obey me and not call. So I hung up the phone, right? So this is the kind of behavior, and it's a silly story, and it's a sibling, fight, and all of us have had that kind of thing growing up. But this is the kind of attitude that Jesus is teaching us we cannot have. We cannot act this way when someone does us wrong. And it is still a command for us today in the church. Romans 12, verse 17 says, "Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all." It's pretty clear there. Do not repay evil for evil. You don't need to do something evil to someone just because they were evil to you. 1 Thessalonians 5 and 15, "See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone." So Paul is writing to the church in Thessalonica here, and he says, always do good to one another. So he's referring to the church members there, but then he adds, and to everyone. So this includes those outside the church as well. Anyone that you might meet who would treat you badly, we cannot have the attitude that we would retaliate. What else are we being asked to do? Jesus is also asking us here to allow mistreatment. So not only when we're wronged are we going to resist retaliating, but we're sometimes going to know we're going to be mistreated and make the decision on purpose to allow that mistreatment and to just simply bear it and put up with it. And this actually would not have been a new teaching for the Jews either, because they had another king in their history, Solomon's father, named David, who had a well-known period of his life where he was being pursued by King Saul. Saul was jealous of David's success and his popularity, and he knew he would ultimately become king, and yet, so Saul was pursuing him to try to destroy him before that could happen. And there's one time when David finds himself hiding in a cave as he's being pursued. And in this pursuit, Saul comes to the same cave. He doesn't know David and his men are hiding in there, but Solomon goes into the cave and he uses it to relieve himself. He uses it as a restroom. Well, David is hiding in the shadows, and he's able to reach over and cut off a piece of Saul's robe while Saul is standing there taking care of business. And then when Saul leaves, we pick up this story. So let's look at this story and this lesson that David gives us about allowing ourselves to be mistreated and why this would not have been a new concept. 1 Samuel 24, verses 4 to 10. If you'll bear with me, this is the longest passage tonight. "And the men of David said to him, Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward David's heart struck him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks you harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against the Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." Now, the reason I call out this story is because this was during a period of David's life when he was repeatedly being mistreated by Saul. He was constantly being pursued by Saul, and he was having to hide himself and to save his life from Saul and his men. And David, no doubt, knew that this was going to continue until the Lord ultimately took care of it. So David shows us an example here of making a conscious decision rather than take revenge against his enemy, rather than strike his enemy down, to allow the mistreatment and wait for the Lord to handle it. And again, we are still commanded to have this attitude today. Ephesians 4, 1-3 says, "I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." We today are to bear with others who treat us badly. We are to have humility and gentleness in the face of those things. Look at Colossians 3, verses 12-14. "Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has complained against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony." So you see, we're supposed to have that forgiving heart when we are mistreated. Let ourselves be mistreated and forbear those things. Look at 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 7. Paul here is he's making a point about Christians taking other Christians to court with lawsuits. And he says in verse 7 there, it says, "To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded?" Paul is saying it's better to simply forbear and let that happen in meekness and gentleness than to fight back. It's better to allow those things knowing that God will take care of you. Now, the third thing that we're being asked to do in this passage is to be generous to all. As if the first two weren't enough, Jesus goes even further. He says, not only are we to resist retaliation, not only are we to sometimes actually just decide to allow ourselves to be mistreated, but we need to make a conscious decision to be generous, to give to those that have need. And once again, the Jews would have been familiar with this. In Deuteronomy 15, 13-15, this is laying out some of the law of Moses. And it says, "And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed." So this is talking about the bondservants. And we've had a sermon about that in the past. But the bondservants, if you owed someone money, you could work for him to help work off that debt. And yet, even if it wasn't totally paid off after a certain number of years, that bondservant was to go free. So there in 14 it says, "You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of the threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this day." So the law tells the people there, it says, you know what it's like to be mistreated. You know what it's like to be in a position of want and to be in a position of being controlled. So when you let that bondservant go, be generous to him. Give him from your plenty, as the Lord has blessed you. Most of you know that I work with infants at my job. and it's the best job I've ever had. Honestly, these are the best patients I've ever had. And there's several reasons for that. But, number one, infants are not ugly to you. They're not hateful and mean to you. They don't call you names. They don't cuss at you, And there are a lot of great lessons that we as Christians can learn from the nature of not only infants, but small children. And there's a reason why Jesus mentions children when he says, "For of such are the kingdom of heaven." But, there is one aspect of infants that is maybe a lesson of something we should not do. And bear with me here because it's not their fault. They don't understand. But when an infant needs something, that infant is going to cry. And if that need is not met, they're going to cry harder. And they're going to cry louder and longer until the need is met. Whatever that need may be, whether it's just they just feel uncomfortable, they're hungry, they're dirty, whatever it is, until that need is met, that infant has no concept that somebody else might need something. No concept at all that they're not the one and only thing in that universe at that moment. Now, the point of that is that it is all in our nature. We are born with the nature to want to be selfish, to want to have our needs taken care of, and to let everyone else fall to the wayside, right? And this is a behavior that we have to unlearn as we grow. We have to as we get older, we start to understand that that's not the behavior we should have, that we do have to care about other people. And once again, this is still expected of us today. Galatians 6, verses 9 to 10. It says, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." Paul here, talking to the church at Galatia, he says, don't get tired of doing good. Keep doing that good. As you have opportunity, do good to everyone that you can. As you see a need, take care of that need. Now, so for our second kind of main overarching point tonight, why is this a hard saying? And this isn't going to be a very long point to make, but as we've gone through these studies, we've talked about the hard sayings of Christ and that idea that they're hard sayings. And why are they hard sayings? Well, some of them are hard because they're kind of hard to understand, or they might not make a lot of sense, and you have to really study them to draw out what Jesus is saying. Then there are others that are really not hard to understand, but they're just hard to do. And that is the category that our study falls into tonight. It's really not hard to understand that Jesus is saying, don't retaliate. Be generous. Allow yourself to be mistreated. The problem is that it is hard to implement. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's not easy to follow his instructions here, especially if someone is asking us to do something that we don't want to do. That is never a fun thing to deal with. In the Roman Empire, there was it's well established and believed, and some of my commentaries that I looked into as well cite this, but there was a law that the Roman soldiers could force a civilian to carry their equipment. And they could make them carry their equipment for up to a Roman mile, which in the studies that I looked at says that was about 1,000 paces, or it would be roughly equivalent to a half mile today, what we would consider a mile today, be about a half mile. And the Roman soldiers could force this, but then at the end of that mile, they had to let that civilian go about their business. They could not make them go any further than that. And this is no doubt exactly what Jesus was talking about when he said, if a man compels you to go a mile, go with him too. Because he's trying to teach us that we have to think differently. We have to react differently when we're being forced to do something that we don't want to do. It's not that it's hard to understand these things. It's just hard to actually do them. Now, to continue with the example of being generous, look at James chapter 2, beginning in verse 14. It It says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." So James is making he's using an example here to teach us that we cannot have only faith or only works. We have to have both. Faith, having faith in God without actually doing something about that faith, doesn't do us any good. And he uses an example here. If someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm hungry, I need some food, I need some clothes," and if you were to say, "Oh, good luck with that. Hope you get what you need," that doesn't help them, does it? And so in this example he uses, we can really take literally and keep in mind that if someone needs something, that if we see that we can fulfill a need, we should be doing that thing. But it's hard. It's very easy for us to just want to stick to ourselves, take care of our own thing, because it goes against our human nature. It's completely backward from how we would normally want to react. If someone comes to me and, asks for something, wants to borrow something or whatever, it's really easy for me to, in the back of my mind, I don't often say this to their face, but in the back of my mind, it's sometimes easy for me to say, "Get your own." Be a grown-up and get your own tool or whatever it is, And I mean, that's mean-spirited. And I'll admit that to you tonight. That's rude. But that's not how we're supposed to react. Romans 7, verses 14 to 15 says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. For I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate." Paul here is lamenting the fact that in our struggle against sin and in our struggle to do what's right, sometimes we know we need to do the right thing and we know what we're supposed to do, and we find ourselves doing the opposite. And it's frustrating because it's against our nature, but it's a fight that we cannot give up. This image is supposed to depict one of my favorite fables growing up. It's called The Scorpion and the Frog. And there's other versions of the fable that use other animals, but the one that always stuck in my mind was The Scorpion and the Frog. And it goes something like this. A scorpion and a frog find themselves on one side of a stream and they need to cross. And the scorpion says to the frog, "Why don't you let me get on your back and you can swim across the stream and we'll both make it across?" And the frog said, "Oh no, I can't do that. If I do that, you'll sting me." And the scorpion said, "But if I sting you, then we'll both drown." So the frog thinks about it and he says, "Okay." So he lets the scorpion on his back and they start swimming across the stream. And sure enough, halfway across the stream, the scorpion stings the frog. And as the frog is dying and sinking beneath the stream, he says, "Why did you do that? Now you're going to drown too." And the scorpion says, "I couldn't help it. It's my nature." Sometimes it's hard to do the right thing. But brothers and sisters, we're not scorpions. We can and should and absolutely should fight against that nature. So, as our third and final overall point tonight, I'm going to talk about some things that I thought of that we can do to kind of practice fighting against our own nature and practice these things. First, we have to battle our own nature and our pride. You have to realize that every time we do something wrong, especially if it's a form of retaliation or being snarky against somebody, it's because of pride. Be aware of that pride. We retaliate because we think we deserve better or are more important than others. Deep down, that's the reason we retaliate. How dare you do that to me? How dare you say that to me? I don't deserve that. I deserve better. And so we strike back. So be aware of that. Romans chapter 12 and verse 3 says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." Paul says he knows. He knows it's easy for us to think greater of ourselves than we should. Hebrews 12, verses 3 to 4, says, "Consider him," talking about Christ, "who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood." This verse 4 here has always been one of my favorites when it comes to the idea of resisting sin. Think about if you're out on the street in a dark alley and somebody attacks you, tries to mug you, tries to take your life, right? You're going to fight that person and you're going to struggle with that person, and that person might draw some blood, but if you come out victorious, that's the goal, right? You're trying to save your life. And that's the idea behind how hard we should be fighting against our nature to sin, fighting against that sin. And think of Christ, who went through unimaginable torture and pain that he did not deserve at the hands of people who were being hateful to him. And he didn't strike back. He didn't retaliate. The second thing we can do is always be on guard. When you think about fighting against certain, different types of temptations. All of us have our own weaknesses and things we struggle with. And we talk about how we want to stay away from those things, opportunities for temptation, right? For example, the easy example is you don't want to take an alcoholic to a bar, right? We can't put ourselves in a place where we're going to be extra tempted, right? And so in this, we can take that same concept, I think, and look out for situations where we might need more patience. Now, sometimes things are going to happen. We're going to end up in a situation that we didn't know was coming, and that's when we have to have that patience and that lack of retaliation and that forbearance. But there may be times when you know you're going to have to talk to somebody about something that might be difficult or whatever, and really prepare yourself. Look out for those situations. Be practiced for those situations so that you're ready for them. Just something to think about. And in 2 Timothy 2, verses 21 to 24, we have some thoughts that we can take from this where it concerns looking out for those situations. It says, "Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil." So a couple things to draw out here. First of all, one thing that is a pitfall of youthful passions is wanting to fight, right? A lot of times, especially guys, tend to have to outgrow that a little bit as they get older and more mature, and they're less inclined to start trying to fight with people, right, and argue with people. The other part that I want to draw out is in verse 23 there, where he says, "Have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies." Look out for those things. Look out for those subjects that you can avoid so that you can avoid being quarrelsome and being in a situation where you have to fight. Ephesians 6 and verse 12 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Now, the reason I've included this verse here is keep in mind that and understand that what we're really fighting is the devil. The devil is out there looking for us, looking for an opportunity to trip us up, looking for an opportunity to bring us down. And so just as much as he's on the lookout for us, be on the lookout for him. Be ready so that we know how to react when these things come up. And finally, another thing we can do is to always make others more important than ourselves. And this is that thing we have to outgrow from our infancy. But if we can always think of others as being more important, not only is this a command, and we'll look at a couple of verses there, but it is good practice. If we always thinking of others as being more important, then we're always ready to treat them as someone more important than us. Philippians 2, verses 3 through 8. "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only on his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. You see, we're supposed to have this mindset, that we count others as more significant than ourselves, that we take care of what they need before what we need, that we model ourselves after Christ, who, after being spit on and struck, and the crown of thorns being shoved on his head, and scourged, and hung on a cross, and killed, that he went through all of that because he counted us more important than himself. He didn't say, oh, I'm God, so no, this is not happening. He didn't do that. That was not his attitude. And that's the mindset that we have to have. So let's consider the next thing Jesus said in a few verses right directly after our passage that we looked at tonight as we close. Matthew 5:43 to 48. It says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the New King James Version, because I appreciated the wording that version used for this one. Jesus says we should love our enemies. Do good to those who treat us badly. That's the mind we have to have. Can we follow Christ's example? Can we obey this hard saying and resist that urge to give back an eye for an eye? If you would like prayers tonight for encouragement in facing mistreatment, in facing the world that beats you down, or if you'd like to begin your walk with Jesus, come forward as we stand and sing.